Dear chess friends, this is MVP bringing you the 11th chapter of my international course on the Caro-Kann defense. Now we will talk about the Panov Attack with the 6th move knight f3 and the endgame line with 15 bishop g5. e4, c6, d4, d5, e takes d5, c takes d5, c4, knight f6, knight c3, knight c6, knight f3, bishop g4, c takes d5, knight takes d5, queen b3, bishop f3, g takes f3, e6, queen b7, knight d4, bishop g5, knight b5, queen c6, king e7, queen b5, queen d7, knight d5, queen d5. I must say that this position occurred in my practice more than 100 times, and bishop g5 is a more popular option than the immediate queen takes d5. f6, queen takes d5, takes d5, bishop e3, and king e6. This is the starting position of this chapter. Now black has a weak square on e6. So let's analyze some white options. The first one is rook g1, then black just plays bishop b4, king e2, and g5, rook ac1, rook hc8, and the position is more or less equal. The next option is rook c1. White wants to bring the rook to a6, but bishop d6, rook c6, rook h8, rook a6, and black has a tactical strike d4. Of course, bishop d4 is impossible due to rook c1, so bishop f4, king f5, rook takes d6, king takes f4, rook d4, king f3, castles, rook d8, Kamrakulov against Nano 2005, the position is equal. The useless move is castles short due to bishop b4, and black has protected the one square, and black has a good game. So the main continuation is castles long and bishop b4. We saw already this idea from the previous chapter. Black controls the one square with the bishop. So here white has some options. The first one is king b1. Now black can play rook hd8. The useless move is rook hg1 due to rook d7, rook g4, and rook b8, rook d3, bishop d6. Black is bringing the bishop to e5 and has an advantage here. So rook d3 is a better option, and a5. Black defends the pawn on a7. And after a3, just bishop f8. If rook c1, then a4, rook c6. It was played in the game Grandmaster Renterman against Grandmaster Smith in Netherlands 2007. And here black should try rook d6, novelty, rook c7, rook d8 with the idea of rook c8 or rook b8. So white can play just rook c6, it's a draw here. And if rook e1, then king f5. Of course, white can play rook e1, king e6, and rook e1, it's just a draw. And if rook c1, then rook d7, rook c6, a4, rook b6. But the position is more or less equal. g5, rook b5, king e6, rook d4, rook a6. So it was a draw. Some moves after, h3, bishop e7, king c2, rook c7, king d3, bishop c5, rook g4, bishop d6. Nielsen against Dominguez, 2002. It was played rook d4, bishop c5, rook g4, bishop d6, and the draw was agreed. So king b1 leads more or less to a forced draw. The next option is rook d3, and here black should try rook hd8. The best continuation for white is king b1, but it just transposes to a previous line. So if a3, it was played in the game Karpov-Kramnik. It's an inaccurate move. Rook a8, king b1, bishop c5, rook e1, and here already Kramnik could play king f7, rook e1, king e6, and it looks like a draw, but he wanted to win, so king d6, a nice continuation, rook g1, g6, rook gd1, king e6, rook e1, bishop s3, rook d3, king f5, with advantage for black. For example, the game it was played rook e7, king f4, rook 1 e3, e5, h3. If rook h7, then rook h8, and white will lose h2 pawn. So h3, h5, rook 7 is 6, king g5, rook a6, d4, f4. Of course, rook a5 just loses due to king h4. So f4, king f5, rook a5, king f4, rook d3, king f4, rook d2, g5. So rook a6, f5, rook a6, king f3, rook a5, king f4, rook a6, h4, rook d3, g4. And here black just is winning, but I don't know where it was the decisive mistake, but the game ended in a draw, so I don't know. I think that just here king b1 is a better move. For a3 looks like a decisive mistake, I don't know. So and if rook h1, it's a bad move due to g5. If rook g4, then a5, a3, rook h8, king b1, bishop c5 is advantage for black, but a3 is just a bad continuation due to bishop d6, and black is bringing the bishop to e5. Rook g1, bishop e5 is advantage for black. Gavrikov, Dreyev, 1995. So the main continuation for white is a3. Black is forced to play rook h8, king b1, bishop c5, rook he1, bishop e3. F takes e3 is a useless move, that leads to the previous chapter, but rook e3 is a good move, because after in d6, rook d1, black has problems with e6 square, but we already saw the move for rook c4. The rook is coming to the king side. Here white has some options to play rook e6 or rook e7. If rook e6, then king c5. Here white has a lot of options. Rook c1, king c1, and king d4. It's very important that black's king is very active in the endgame. Rook e7, rook c8, king d2, rook d8, b4, a5, destroying the white's king side. B takes a5, rook a8, rook g7, rook a5, rook h7, rook h3. With draw in the game Gulko against Pentava Hare-Krishna, Bled 2002. The other option is to play rook a6, but here rook f4 is possible, rook c1, king d4, rook c3, and black plays in a very strange way, king e5, rook e3, king f5, and black brings just the king to the king side from the queen side. Very unusual chess. Rook d3, king g6, rook d5, and here, of course, f3 is not so important, but the h2 pawn is rook h4, f4. It was the game again against Guliev Moscow 1997. Here, black should try to do novelty h5, rook g5, king h6, rook g2, and rook f4. And black is just better because they can play something like rook e4, rook e7, and bring the rook into the attack. If white plays rook g1, then rook h4, rook c1, rook c4, rook d1, a5, rook e7, rook h4, rook d7, rook h2, rook 1 d5, king c6, rook d5 c6, to king c5, rook d2, rook g2, a4. White tries to mate black's king, but king c6, rook 7 d6, king c7, rook 6 d3, and just rook b8, rook d5, and rook g5. Black sacrifices a pawn, but the result in endgame is drawish. Rook g5, h take g5, rook d5, h6, rook a5, rook b4, rook a7, king b8, rook g7, rook takes a4, and white has an extra pawn, but it's just a rook endgame, so the position is drawn here. The main continuation for white on the move number 25 is b4, but then king b5, rook d6, a5, king a4 is also interesting, rook d5, king a4, rook a5, rook a5 takes a5, king a5, rook a7, and just rook h4, rook g7, rook h2. Care against Vandel for 2009, the position is drawn here. So rook e6 is more or less draw, and rook e7, as we will see, it's also drawish continuation. Rook h4, and here white also has some options. If king c2, white is trying to mate the black's king. Rook takes h2, rook 1 e6, king c5, king d3, but black just takes on f2, rook c7, king b5, rook b7, king a5, king e3, rook c2, b3, d4, king takes d4, and black should play here rook d8, king e3, rook c3, king e2, rook c2, king e1 with transpose into the game. They made a slight inaccuracy rook c1, because here white could play rook g7 with advantage, but after king d3, rook d8, king e2, rook c2, king e1, e3, it was like the game, rook c3, king e2, rook c2, king e1. It was Antau against Erdos 2008, and the easiest way to do a draw is the move rook d3, because after rook g7, rook takes f3, rook h7, rook takes b3. White can't win the rook because rook a7, king b5, rook b7, and black has a move king c4, and if rook c6, then king d5, and white just exchanges the rook. It's a draw. Another way for a draw is b4, but here black plays d4, rook g7, rook h2, rook g4, king d5, rook d1, rook f2, rook d4, king c6, and black has decent compensation for a pawn, because they can bring the second rook to e2. For example, rook f4, rook a8, rook f6, king b5, and the position is just drawish. So rook 1 e6, king c5, and rook g7. White takes the pawn, and black also takes the pawn. Rook h2. The grandmaster draw is to play rook c7, king d4, rook c1, rook f2, rook d1, king c5, rook c1, king d4. Just a draw, Rager against Master Vasilis, 2011. And if rook f6, then rook f2, rook h7, rook b8. It's dangerous to play before due to king c4, and white can be mated. So rook c7, king d4, rook c2, rook c2, king c2. White wants the pawn, but the passed pawn is too dangerous. a5, and the move is rook a6. Rook c6 changes nothing. Rook h8, a4, rook h2, king b1, rook f2, rook c3, rook f1, king c2, rook f2, king b1, rook f1, king e2, rook f2. So it was a draw. Some moves later, rook b3, king c4, rook c3, king b4, rook d3, king c4, rook c3, Saba against Bekesh, Budapest, 2009. So the main continuation is rook a6 and rook c8 check. It's very dangerous for white to play king b1, king e3, rook a5, d4. Only black can win here. So king d2, rook b8, king c2, rook c8, king d2, draw, Belikov against Dreyev, Moscow, 1992. So what can we tell about this chapter? The play here is more or less forced. White has to play in the main variation, where black just plays bishop b4, rook f8, bishop c5, and the rook endgame arises. So we saw that it is very well analyzed already. Some of my analyses are up to 35 or 40 move. And everywhere is just equal endgame, drawish endgame. So the only downside of the endgame for black is that just there are no chances to play for a win, because it's just a forced draw. So if you are playing against a weak opponent, and that opponent knows something in the endgame, you must think if you want to play the move knight c6 at all. So thank you for watching this video till the end. If you like this video, you consider leaving a like, and see you next time.